Hi class, today we will be discussing the first colonies. We will be talking about the Jamestown Colony, the Plymouth Colony, and also the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Within each colony, we'll talk about how each colony got there, why they went to the Americas, and also how they survived. The first colony that we will be discussing is the Jamestown Colony. In May of 1607, three English ships, the Discover, Godspeed, and Susan Constant, arrived at what is now known as Jamestown, Virginia. They brought with them gentlemen or men of a military background, craftsmen, artisans, a minister, and Captain John Smith. You may have heard of him from Pocahontas, and that's roughly what that movie is based on, but it's not very factually based, so please listen to the rest. So there were no women that came with them to Jamestown. They named Jamestown after King James I of England, who granted the Virginia Company of London a charter to invest and finance a trip to the New World. So what does all of that mean? Basically, you can't travel to the New World without money. So they had to look for investors, and the best way to get money is to go through the king. They had special companies that would invest in these trips, and they would supply the money that the explorers and settlers needed to get to the New World and also to establish a colony there. The difference between exploration and colonization is that exploration is simply finding the land, whereas colonization is setting up a community on that land. So basically they were extending England outside of Europe and taking it to present-day United States. So why did the colonists go there? We've talked about the reasons for exploration being God, gold, and glory, and those tie in very easily to the reasons that colonists arrived to certain lands. The particular colony of Jamestown wanted to go to the Americas and set up a colony there because they thought it would be an economic prize for England, where they could eventually sell more than they purchased in the global economy. So with just England by itself, they were at a disadvantage in comparison to the Spaniards who had taken over the Caribbean and southern part of North America, and also the French that had done some settling as well. So they wanted to engage in that global economy and not only have trade outlets in Africa and Europe, but also set up a place somewhere where they could actually claim that land and all the resources that it had, and use that coast of Virginia as a port. English heard that the Spanish found mountains of gold. So the Spanish had explored that area, and there were rumors going around saying that in this particular part of the Americas, gold could be found. So that ties into that one of those three G's as well. They also thought it could be a sea route to Asia for trading purposes, so maybe a stopping point if you're going to go through the Strait of Magellan and head to Asia. And they also wanted to spread Christianity. So we have our God in there, we have our gold, and finding that economic prize would definitely give you some glory as well. So how did they succeed? At first, the colonists at Jamestown were not so lucky. They faced starvation caused by a drought the very first year. So without rain, you're unable to grow food. They were unable to find those abundant resources that would not only help them develop an economy, but also help to feed their colony. They also faced hostility from some of the original inhabitants, so some of the Native Americans that were in that area, most specifically the Powhatan tribe. In May 1611, new ships brought additional people, including women, so this introduced a new type of population to the colony. They also brought with them supplies, livestock, many things where they could develop some farmland and start to develop resources and using that livestock as a farming tool as well. They also built and repaired structures and established strict rules. So in order for their society to run in an orderly fashion, they needed to set up some guidelines. So this is where we start to see some of the first law-like decisions being made within what is now our country. Repairing structures such as houses and buildings where you could store supplies was very important. It established that they would be staying there for a while. It also helped to protect any items that they might have. Fighting with the Powhatans ceased after an agreement to return the kidnapped daughter of the chief Pocahontas. So this is where Pocahontas comes into the story. The Jamestown Colony had kidnapped Pocahontas, and in order to get her back, they had to stop the fighting. So they came up with a treaty between the two in order to get along. Tobacco had a major influence on the success of the Jamestown Colony. The Native Americans introduced tobacco to Jamestown, and what we know now is it's very addictive. So tobacco became a very influential cash crop. Once people had it, they needed to have it. So starting to grow that in Jamestown made it an economic source in the global trade, and that's exactly what they originally wanted to come to Virginia for. In these pictures you can see a drawing of Pocahontas and also the shape of the Jamestown Colony itself. You can tell it's right on the coast, making it good access for trade and ports. Now let's talk about the Plymouth Colony. This is one that you've probably heard of around Thanksgiving time when we talk about pilgrims. So what happened? How did they get here? In November of 1620, pilgrims, or religious separatists who journeyed to find religious freedom, landed in what is now Massachusetts after sailing from England on the Mayflower. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the Mayflower before. Pilgrim is a word to describe this group of people because they wanted to leave England due to religious persecution, or they were attacked based on their religious beliefs because it didn't tie into what the king wanted them to believe. They established their home in an empty Indian village that had been wiped out by an epidemic. So we've talked about the Columbian Exchange before, and this is an example of the impact that it had. People from other countries were able to come in and take over that space where sadly Native Americans had passed and left their belongings behind. So why did they settle this colony? Their name gives you a hint as to why. They wanted to seek and establish religious freedom after being persecuted by the king for their religious differences. So once again, we have that persecuted word, basically meaning attacked for something that makes them different. So the king gave them a charter to go and explore a certain part of land, so their trip was able to be financed. If they settled within that place where their charter told them to go, then they would have to abide by the king's rules, meaning they'd have to follow certain religious requirements, certain trade requirements, certain English laws. It would just transfer to that same land. However, they actually landed right outside those charter's boundaries, and due to that mistake, they were able to remain separate from England until the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which that colony we'll talk about in a little bit. They became so big that they ended up taking over the little tiny Plymouth Colony. Also, the Mayflower Compact was a major aspect of their settling. It was kind of like one of the first bodies of law within North America, and it helped them to establish good relationships with each other and also the people around them. So how did they survive? I had already mentioned the Mayflower Compact. It's similar to the Constitution and supplied rules and regulations for how the colony would be ran. So on Constitution Day, we talked about how the Constitution sets up the structure of the government. The Mayflower Compact did something very similar, and it also set up rules that they would govern by, just to make life run more smoothly and give them opportunities. On Constitution Day, we also talked about how if groups that follow a rule of law oftentimes are more successful. So this might contribute to the success of the Plymouth Colony as well. In 1621, they established a peace treaty with the native inhabitants chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe. We actually took a look at this treaty in your groups of class, and many of you discussed how this was different from the Spanish because they were establishing a peaceful relationship with the Native Americans rather than just taking over and assuming that they had a more important role. Oftentimes we remember the Pilgrims for Thanksgiving and how they shared a meal with the Native Americans, so that's an example of that peaceful encounter between both. But due to that peace treaty, it not only helped to settle any conflict that might arise, but it also developed a relationship where the Native Americans could show them how to properly cultivate the land. They had lived on that land for hundreds and hundreds of years, so they knew exactly the ways to use it to benefit them. Massachusetts does not necessarily have the best soil, so it's really important that they knew how to cultivate the corn, and that was a major key to their survival. They also developed an economy by trading fish and furs. As I mentioned before, rocky soil made agriculture very difficult, so they needed to look somewhere else where they could develop an economy. And using furs and fish, they could engage in that global economy process, and also with trading with the Native Americans as well. This shows you the location of the Plymouth Colony. They're right here on this little horn that sticks out. And then we have the picture of the first Thanksgiving feast as well.